Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. The small plane's twin engines thundered through the crystalline blue sky of the Montana wilderness, their deep, rhythmic roar cutting through the stillness like a living creature hungry for altitude. The 1967 Cessna 310, a wedding gift from Sarah's father, vibrated beneath them with each combustion cycle, its aluminum skin catching the mid-morning sunlight in flashes that would have blinded anyone watching from below. The propellers spun into near invisibility, creating perfect circles of transparent motion against the backdrop of distant, snow-capped peaks. Below, an endless sea of emerald pines stretched toward distant crags, their dark needles whispering secrets to the breeze that had begun to pick up from the west. Valleys carved by ancient glaciers wound between ridges, revealing flashes of silver where hidden streams caught the light. In the cockpit, David Thompson sat rigidly at the controls, his calloused hands, marked by 15 years of construction work before he'd earned his pilot's license, wrapped around the yoke with the practiced tension of someone who respected the machine but never fully trusted it. The leather of the control wheel was worn smooth in places from countless flights, fitting his grip like an old baseball glove. A thin sheen of sweat coated his brow despite the cool air flowing through the cabin vents, equal parts exhilaration and unease as the altimeter needle quivered past 12,000 feet. He inhaled the sharp tang of aviation fuel that always seemed to permeate the cabin, no matter how well maintained the aircraft, mixed with the crisp mountain air that somehow found its way inside, carrying hints of pine sap and distant wildflowers. His heart pounded against his ribs, a sensation he never quite got used to during these family flights, as he guided his precious cargo closer to their long-awaited vacation at Whitefish Lake, where his father's cabin waited with its creaking porch swing and the promise of 2 weeks away from deadlines, school schedules, and the incessant ping of email notifications. In the back of the cabin, golden sunlight slanted through the tiny oval windows, catching dust motes that danced like microscopic fireflies in the pressurized air. The warm glow illuminated Sarah's gentle smile, the one that always appeared at the corners of her mouth first, before spreading to create the dimple in her left cheek that David had fallen in love with 15 years ago. Her slender fingers, adorned only with her simple platinum wedding band, worked methodically to secure Emma and Max into their seats, checking each buckle with the practiced vigilance of a mother who had memorized every car seat manual and airplane safety card. Emma sat perfectly still, her posture betraying the boarding school etiquette classes Sarah had insisted on last summer. At 12, she straddled that delicate threshold between childhood wonder and teenage self-consciousness. Her wide hazel eyes, so much like David's, sparkled with anticipation she was trying hard to contain within the dignified demeanor she'd recently adopted. Wisps of her honey-brown hair had escaped from her careful French braid, framing a face that was losing its childish roundness. "Can you believe we'll be camping beneath those peaks?" she asked, her voice bright as the morning sun, though pitched slightly lower than usual in an attempt to sound mature. Her fingers absently traced the friendship bracelet on her wrist, woven in blues and purples by her best friend Lily as a goodbye present for the trip. Beside her, Max could not have presented a greater contrast to his sister's composure. At 8, he was all limbs and energy, a perpetual motion machine barely contained by the seatbelt that he kept testing with little bounces that made the entire row vibrate. His Spider-Man t-shirt was already rumpled, and a smudge of breakfast syrup still clung to the corner of his mouth despite Sarah's attempts to clean it off at the airport. His unruly mop of chestnut curls, overdue for a haircut that he'd been skillfully avoiding, bobbed with each movement. "I can't wait to spot elk and maybe even a bear," he exclaimed, for perhaps the 20th time that morning, his voice carrying that distinctive childish pitch that seemed to penetrate every corner of the small aircraft. He pressed his forehead against the cool plexiglass window, leaving a small fog of condensation from his excited breathing, and then used his index finger to draw a quick smiley face that disappeared almost as quickly as he'd created it. David's gaze drifted upward through the scratched plexiglass window, where a bank of slate-gray clouds was building along the western horizon, their underbellies dark and swollen like bruises against the fading blue. The distant peaks had disappeared behind the approaching wall of precipitation that hung like a theater curtain between sky and earth. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Looks like we'll run into some weather," he said in a steady tone that belied the tightening knot in his chest, a cold finger of dread tracing his spine. His right hand instinctively tightened around the worn leather of the yoke, while his left adjusted the throttle minutely. The altimeter needle quivered before his eyes, and he blinked away the sting of sweat that had beaded along his brow. Sarah's smile faltered, the dimple in her left cheek vanishing, as her lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced back at the children, then leaned closer to David, the faint scent of her lavender shampoo momentarily cutting through the metallic smell of the cabin. Her slender fingers gripped the edge of her seat until her knuckles blanched white, the platinum of her wedding band catching the last rays of sunlight before the clouds engulfed them completely. "Don't worry," David replied, forcing calm into his voice as his stomach churned with acid. He reached over to squeeze her hand, leaving a damp print on her skin. "We're almost there. 20 minutes, tops." He glanced at the fuel gauge, its needle hovering just above the quarter mark, enough to reach their destination, but not enough for significant detours. Behind them, Emma had gone silent, her hazel eyes wide as she stared out the window at the approaching darkness, while Max continued to bounce in his seat, oblivious to the tension that had settled over the adults like an invisible fog. Moments later, the storm arrived in full fury, faster than David had anticipated, as if the mountains themselves had conjured it from nothing. The first raindrops struck the windshield like bullets, instantly transforming into rivulets that distorted his vision of the terrain ahead. A blast of icy wind rocked the fuselage from port to starboard, rattling overhead panels and sending coffee sloshing from plastic cups onto the beige carpet. The cabin temperature plummeted 10 degrees in seconds, and the smell of ozone filled the air, sharp and electric. The navigation instruments flickered once, twice, then stabilized as David's pulse thundered in his ears. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently, like a bronco bucking its rider, throwing the cabin into chaos. A bag of trail mix exploded across the floor. Max's handheld game clattered against the window, and Sarah's paperback novel slid beneath the seat. The aircraft dropped 200 feet in an instant, and David's stomach seemed to float up into his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs as he wrestled with the yoke, his biceps burning with the strain of fighting the crosswinds that batted the small craft like a cat toying with a mouse. The artificial horizon tilted crazily on the instrument panel, and sweat now poured freely down his temples, stinging his eyes and soaking the collar of his blue chambray shirt. "Everyone hold on," he shouted, voice raw over the howl of wind that somehow penetrated the cabin's insulation. The words scraped his throat like sandpaper. Behind him, Max began to cry, high-pitched and terrified, a sound David had never heard from his son before. Lightning tore across the sky, a jagged white scar that branched in all directions, illuminating the cabin in stark, ghostly flashes that rendered everyone's faces in monochrome horror movie pallor. In the strobe-like effect, David caught glimpses of his family. Sarah's arms tightened around the children, her face a mask of determined protection, even as terror widened her eyes. Emma's knuckles whitened as she clutched Max's hand, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer or words of comfort to her brother. Max's tears glistening on cheeks drained of color, his Spider-Man shirt now darkened with spilled juice. The engines began to sputter, first the right, then, horrifically, the left, each cough and sputter echoing like distant thunder, the propellers visibly slowing against the backdrop of churning clouds. A red warning light blinked on the console, accompanied by a high-pitched beeping that seemed to drill directly into David's skull. The wings trembled, then dipped as gravity seized them, the aluminum skin of the aircraft groaning in protest. Rain lashed horizontally now, driven by winds that must have exceeded 60 knots. David fought the controls with every ounce of strength in his body, his shoulders screaming in protest, a vein throbbing visibly at his temple. He jabbed desperately at the radio, shouting, "Mayday! Mayday!" into the microphone, but only static answered him. They were too deep in the mountains, too far from any receiver. The storm was merciless, a living entity that seemed determined to pluck them from the sky. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he caught terrifying glimpses of the terrain below, no longer distant, but rushing up to meet them with alarming speed. The roar of the engines faded into an ominous silence. As the plane tilted nose down, the propellers now windmilling uselessly, the altimeter unwound with sickening speed. In that final, breathless instant, time seemed to stretch like taffy. David had the absurd clarity to notice everything. The coffee stain on his left pant leg, the tiny spider crack in the corner of the instrument panel, the gold flecks in Sarah's wide eyes as she mouthed, "I love you," the freckle on Emma's right cheek that matched his own, the missing front tooth and Max's open-mouthed wail. The world became a dizzying swirl of dark foliage and bare earth rushing up to meet them, the tops of massive pines reaching up like grasping fingers. David's last conscious thought was not of fear, but of fierce, desperate love for the three people behind him, and a silent promise that somehow, he would get them through this. Chapter 2. Awakening in the Woods. David blinked awake to a world fragmented by pain. His consciousness returned in jagged pieces. First the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, then the high-pitched whine that drilled through his eardrums like a dentist's tool. The stench hit him next, acrid smoke, spilled aviation fuel, and something else, the unmistakable copper penny smell of fresh blood mingling with scorched insulation and burnt rubber. His flight jacket clung to him, soaked through with sweat and morning dew, the leather collar digging into the tender flesh of his neck where a bruise was already forming. He tried to orient himself in the dappled half-light. Shards of the Cessna's fuselage lay scattered across the forest floor like the discarded skeleton of some massive aluminum beast. 20 feet away, the right wing had sheared clean off, now impaled through the trunk of an ancient pine. The instrument panel dangled by a nest of multicolored wires, its gauges shattered, their tiny glass teeth glinting in the filtered sunlight. Overhead, a ragged tear in the forest canopy marked their violent descent, a crooked pathway of broken branches and stripped bark. With monumental effort, David turned his head 6 agonizing inches to the left. Sarah knelt in the pine needle carpet, her blonde hair matted with dirt and something darker that made his stomach clench. A 3-inch gash across her forehead had painted the right side of her face crimson, but her hands moved with surprising steadiness as she tended to Max. Their 10-year-old son lay curled on his side, clutching his left arm to his chest, his Spider-Man t-shirt torn at the shoulder. Max's face, usually animated with mischief, was now a portrait of suffering, his freckles standing out starkly against skin blanched white with shock. His small chest heaved with each shallow breath, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks. "Is everyone okay?" David croaked, his voice barely recognizable to his own ears. He braced his palms against the damp earth, attempting to push himself upright. A lightning bolt of pain shot from his lower ribs through his spine, forcing a strangled gasp from his throat. 3, possibly 4 broken ribs, he thought, with detached clinical precision, the knowledge from his 2 semesters of pre-med suddenly, ironically useful. Sarah's head snapped up at the sound of his voice, relief washing over her blood-streaked features. "David, thank God! I've got some cuts and bruises, nothing serious. Emma hit her head pretty hard, but she's been conscious the whole time." She gestured toward their 13-year-old daughter, who sat huddled against the remains of a seat cushion, her knees drawn up to her chest. "Max took the worst of it. I think his wrist is sprained, maybe broken. He can't move his fingers without crying." Her voice dropped to a whisper, trembling with the effort of contained panic. "We need to get out of here, find help. I don't know how long before—" She cut herself off, glancing at the children. Emma pushed herself up slowly, wincing as she touched the egg-sized lump forming at her temple. Her eyes, the same hazel as David's, widened as she took in their surroundings. The towering pines that stretched in every direction, the dense undergrowth of ferns and berry bushes, and the complete and utter absence of anything resembling civilization. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice small and hollow in the vastness. "It's just trees everywhere." The tremble in her usually confident voice cut David more deeply than any of his physical injuries. "We crashed in the forest, sweetheart," David said, forcing himself to take slow, measured breaths, despite the knife-like pain in his side. He noticed Emma's favorite book, the dog-eared copy of The Hobbit she'd been reading during takeoff, lying open nearby, its pages fluttering in the gentle breeze like the wings of a wounded bird. "But we're together," he continued, meeting Sarah's eyes across the clearing, drawing strength from the determined set of her jaw. "And we'll find a way back, I promise." For the next hour, they methodically searched the wreckage, salvaging what they could from the scattered remains of their vacation supplies. David found his duffel bag wedged between two sections of fuselage, the canvas torn but the contents mostly intact. Sarah discovered her purse hanging from a branch 10 yards from the main crash site, the strap tangled in a thorn bush as if placed there deliberately. By sunset, their inventory was depressingly sparse. A heavy-duty maglite with 4 spare batteries, a compact first aid kit, thankfully still sealed, 6 granola bars, a half-crushed box of crackers, 3 bottles of water, a Swiss Army knife, and, miraculously, a book of waterproof matches David had packed for the cabin's fireplace. The once bright July day faded into dusk with alarming speed, as if the forest itself was eager to cloak them in darkness. The temperature dropped noticeably, and with it came the symphony of the wilderness, the soft rustling of leaves overhead, the distant hooting of an owl beginning its nightly hunt, the chittering of unseen creatures in the underbrush. But beneath these familiar sounds lurked something else, something that raised the fine hairs on the back of David's neck, the unsettling, persistent sensation of being observed by hidden eyes. As night fell completely, the darkness became a living entity, pressing against them from all sides. The shadows between the trees seemed to pulse and shift, transforming harmless stumps and bushes into crouching predators. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind through the branches sent jolts of adrenaline through David's exhausted body. He knelt in a small clearing, attempting to arrange a pyramid of twigs and pine needles for a fire. The matches trembled between his fingers, once steady hands that had performed countless minor surgeries, now betraying him when his family needed him most. The first match broke. The second flared briefly before dying in the evening breeze. The third slipped from his grasp entirely, falling into the dirt where its potential warmth and comfort extinguished instantly. "David!" Sarah's voice drifted to him from where she sat with Max cradled against her chest, her arms wrapped protectively around his small frame. The boy had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, his injured arm carefully immobilized with strips torn from Sarah's cotton blouse and the rigid plastic backing from the first aid kit. "Do you think anyone's looking for us?" The question hung in the frigid air between them, laden with all the fears neither dared voice aloud. In the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy, he could see the glint of unshed tears in her eyes, the stubborn tilt of her chin as she fought to maintain composure for their children. "Of course they are," David replied with conviction he didn't feel, finally coaxing a small flame to life. The fire cast their faces in flickering amber light, creating more shadows than it dispelled. "We filed a flight plan. When we don't arrive, they'll send search parties." He didn't mention how vast these mountains were, how easily a small aircraft could disappear into the wilderness, how statistically unlikely it was for survivors to be found within the critical first 72 hours. Instead, he forced a smile that felt like a grimace. "They'll find us." But as he settled back against a fallen log, pulling Emma's sleeping form closer to share body heat, doubt gnawed at him like a physical presence. The reality of their situation, 4 injured people with minimal supplies, miles from any trail or road, in a forest teeming with unknown dangers, settled in his stomach like a stone, cold and immovable. Above them, through a break in the trees, a handful of stars glittered with indifferent brilliance, impossibly distant and unconcerned with the tiny human drama unfolding beneath their eternal watch. Chapter 3. First Steps into the Unknown. The sun rose the next morning, casting a pale, watery light through the canopy of ancient pines. Fingers of mist curled between the trunks, giving the forest an otherworldly quality that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. David's body protested with a symphony of pain as he pushed himself upright, each broken rib announcing itself with knife-like precision, the bruises on his back and shoulders having deepened to a mottled purple-black overnight. His tongue felt thick with dehydration, his lips cracked and bleeding at the corners. He took in the full extent of their predicament in the unforgiving morning light. The plane, their cheerful little Cessna that had gleamed so brightly at takeoff just yesterday, lay like a wounded animal, its fuselage torn open, one wing completely sheared off and lodged 20 feet up in the branches of a massive Douglas fir. The scattered debris created a chaotic path through the underbrush. Seat cushions, luggage, the shattered remains of Max's Nintendo Switch that had been a birthday present just 3 weeks ago. The acrid smell of aviation fuel still hung in the air, mingling with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. "We need to find water," he announced, trying to infuse his voice with a confidence he didn't feel. His medical training had taught him the rule of threes: 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. The granola bars wouldn't last long between the 4 of them. Stay close and don't wander off. The forest can disorient you in seconds. Sarah nodded, her face a mask of exhaustion beneath the dried blood and dirt. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night keeping watch over the children, starting at every unfamiliar sound that echoed through the darkness. Now she gently shook Emma awake while David knelt beside Max, whose splinted wrist rested awkwardly across his chest. "Are we going to be okay?" Max whispered as David helped him stand, his 7-year-old face pinched with a worry no child should have to carry. He clutched Emma's hand with his good one, his knuckles white, as they began to walk. His Spider-Man sneakers, the light-up ones he'd begged for, were scuffed and muddy, one shoelace trailing dangerously underfoot. "Of course we are," Emma replied, squeezing his fingers reassuringly. At 13, she was trying so hard to be the strong big sister, but David caught the tremor in her voice, saw how her free hand twisted nervously in the hem of her once white t-shirt. The lump on her temple had darkened overnight, spreading a yellowish bruise down to her cheekbone. Her eyes darted constantly between the trees, as if expecting something to lunge out at them at any moment. They pressed on through the underbrush, battling fatigue and the growing knot of fear that tightened with each step. The forest floor was a treacherous maze of exposed roots, fallen logs covered in slippery moss, and unexpected dips that threatened to twist an ankle. Thorny blackberry vines snagged at their clothing, leaving tiny scratches on exposed skin that stung in the cool morning air. David's instincts, honed from childhood camping trips with his father in these very mountains, kicked in. leading them northeast toward a stream he remembered seeing during the final moments of their flight, just before the engine had sputtered and died. But with every step, the tension increased. The forest felt oppressive, almost alive in its hostility. The trees seemed to close in around them, branches reaching like gnarled fingers, blocking more and more of the strengthening sunlight. Birds fell silent as they passed, creating pockets of eerie quiet that made the hairs on the back of David's neck stand up. Twice he thought he heard something large moving parallel to their path, just out of sight in the dense undergrowth. But when he stopped to listen, there was only the whisper of wind through the pines. Sarah stumbled over a hidden rock, catching herself against a tree trunk with a sharp intake of breath. "How much further?" she asked, her voice barely audible as she pressed her hand to her side, where a deep bruise was forming. She'd been hiding her own injuries, focusing entirely on the children, but David could see the pain etched in the tight lines around her mouth, the careful way she held herself. "Not far now," he promised, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. The forest played tricks with distance and direction. Landmarks that seemed distinctive blended together after hours of walking. He glanced at his watch, a wedding gift from Sarah, its face now cracked but still functioning, and was shocked to see that nearly 3 hours had passed since they had left the crash site. After what felt like an eternity, Emma's voice broke the silence. "Dad, look!" She pointed ahead where the trees finned slightly, revealing a glimpse of movement beyond. The sound reached them moments later, the unmistakable gurgle and splash of running water. They quickened their pace, hope giving them a second wind. Max's face lit up with the first real smile since the crash as they pushed through a final stand of ferns and found themselves on the rocky bank of a stream. The water rushed over smooth stones, crystal clear and inviting, catching the mid-morning sunlight in diamond-like sparkles. "Finally!" David exclaimed, the relief almost overwhelming as he knelt down on the pebbly shore, wincing as his ribs protested. He scooped the cold water in his cupped hands, the liquid like silk against his parched skin. It tasted of minerals and wilderness, sweeter than any bottled water he'd ever had. "Can we drink it?" Max asked, his eyes wide with uncertainty as he crouched beside his father. His small face was smudged with dirt, a scratch running from his ear to his jaw where a branch had caught him during their trek. "Mom says stream water makes you sick." "Yes, it's safe," Sarah assured him, taking a tentative sip herself before nodding with more confidence. She smoothed back his tangled hair, leaving a clean streak on his forehead where her wet fingers passed. "We're okay, buddy. This high up in the mountains, the water's clean enough." She didn't mention the risk of giardia or other parasites, problems that would take days to manifest and seem insignificant compared to their immediate need for hydration. Emma waded ankle-deep into the stream, gasping at the cold but laughing, the sound startlingly normal in their abnormal circumstances. She splashed water on her face, washing away the worst of the grime and dried blood, revealing the constellation of freckles across her nose that matched David's own. As they drank and filled the 3 water bottles they'd salvaged from the crash, the initial relief gave way to an overwhelming sense of despair that settled in David's chest like a physical weight. They were lost, stranded in a vast wilderness with no way to call for help. The plane's emergency locator transmitter had been damaged in the crash. He'd checked it first thing, and none of their cell phones had signal. His mind raced with thoughts of what could go wrong, infection setting into their untreated cuts, Max's wrist healing improperly, wild animal encounters, exposure to the elements if the weather turned. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s overnight. They'd been lucky it wasn't raining. "We should find some shelter for the night," he said finally, watching as Sarah helped Max wash his face, her movements gentle despite her own exhaustion. The eyes were already drooping again, shock and trauma taking their toll on his small body. We'll figure out our next steps after that. David didn't voice the question that haunted him. Would anyone even know where to look for them? How far had they drifted off course before the crash? The vastness of the wilderness around them seemed to mock the very idea of rescue. Chapter 4. The Struggle Begins. That evening, after searching for hours through the darkening forest, they stumbled upon a small clearing nestled between two ancient pines. Several fallen logs, victims of some long-ago storm, lay in a rough semicircle, their bark peeling away in papery strips. David ran his hand over one, feeling the softness of decay beneath his fingertips, but finding the core still solid enough to provide structure. The clearing itself was carpeted with pine needles that released their sharp, clean scent with every footfall, a smell that reminded David of Christmas mornings and happier times. "This will work," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst. She was cradling her left arm against her body, though she hadn't mentioned any injury there. The bruise on her temple had darkened to a deep purple, stark against her increasingly pale skin. David nodded, forcing enthusiasm into his voice for the children's sake. "It's perfect. We can use these logs as a foundation." For the next hour, as the last light drained from the sky, David and Sarah worked methodically despite their exhaustion. They gathered armfuls of broad maple leaves, still green and flexible, layering them like shingles over a framework of branches they'd wedged between the logs. Sarah showed Emma how to weave smaller twigs together to create walls that might block the wind, while David and Max collected handfuls of moss from the north sides of trees to stuff into the gaps. The children tried to help, but their movements grew increasingly sluggish. Emma's usual nimble fingers fumbled with the twigs, and twice she had to stop to wipe away silent tears when she thought no one was looking. Max sat down heavily on one of the logs, his injured wrist cradled in his lap. His Spider-Man sneaker flickered weakly with each tap, the batteries nearly dead. "I'm hungry, Dad," Max finally said. His stomach punctuated the statement with an audible growl that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Really, really hungry." He looked up at David with eyes that seemed too large for his dirt-smudged face, trust and fear battling for dominance in his expression. David crouched down in front of his son, ignoring the sharp protest from his ribs. He brushed a leaf from Max's hair, noticing how the boy's cheeks had already begun to look hollower after just one day without proper food. "I know, buddy," he replied, his heart aching as if physically wounded. "We'll find something to eat soon, I promise." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, but he forced a confidence into his voice that he didn't feel. As the makeshift shelter took shape, more a lean-to than anything resembling a proper structure, Sarah led the children on a careful circuit around the clearing. They scavenged for anything edible, their eyes straining in the fading light. Emma discovered a patch of small, round berries growing on low bushes at the edge of the clearing. They were deep blue-black, similar to blueberries, but smaller, with a silvery bloom on their skin. "Look," she called, excitement momentarily brightening her voice. She cupped a handful of the tiny fruits, holding them out for inspection. The berries rolled in her palm, leaving faint purple stains on her skin. "Can we eat these?" David and Sarah exchanged a glance, their limited knowledge of foraging suddenly a terrifying gap in their abilities to protect their children. David's father had taught him about fishing and tracking, but edible plants had never been part of those lessons. "What if they're poisonous?" Emma asked, her initial excitement fading as she registered her parents' hesitation. She let the berries roll from her palm back onto the bush, wiping her stained fingers against her jeans. "I don't want to get sick out here." "They look like huckleberries," David said, plucking one and rolling it between his fingers, releasing a sweet, tangy scent. "I think they're safe." But uncertainty lingered in his mind, a cold knot of fear that tightened when he thought about the consequences of being wrong. He'd read stories of experienced foragers dying from a single misidentification. Sarah took one of the berries and examined it closely, then cautiously placed it on her tongue. "It tastes right," she said after a moment, "sweet, a little tart, like a blueberry." She swallowed it and waited, as if expecting immediate confirmation one way or the other. They gathered a small handful, David insisting that he try them first, waiting 30 minutes before allowing anyone else to eat. When no ill effects manifested, they carefully harvested more, but the bushes yielded barely enough to take the edge off their hunger. The small fruits burst between their teeth, momentarily flooding their mouths with sweetness before the gnawing emptiness returned. As night fully descended, bringing with it a bone-deep chill, they huddled together beneath their makeshift shelter. The temperature dropped rapidly, their breath forming small clouds in the air. Tensions began to rise as hunger gnawed at their bellies, making sleep elusive despite their physical exhaustion. Max was particularly restless, shifting position every few minutes, his small body unable to get comfortable on the hard ground. His anxiety was palpable in the darkness, radiating from him in waves that seemed to fill their small shelter. "We're gonna starve, aren't we?" he wailed suddenly, breaking the silence of the forest night. His voice cracked on the last word, and tears began streaming down his face, catching the faint moonlight that filtered through gaps in their roof. His shoulders shook with each sob, and he curled into himself, making his small frame even smaller. "We're never getting out of here." Emma, who had been drifting into an uneasy sleep, immediately rolled toward her brother. Despite her own fear, she wrapped an arm around his trembling shoulders, pulling him close against her side. "No, we're not," she replied fiercely, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even David. Her eyes caught the moonlight, flashing with determination as she squeezed Max's uninjured hand. "We just need to be strong. Dad knows what he's doing and Mom's super smart. We're Thompsons, remember? Thompsons don't give up." In the darkness, David felt Sarah's hand find his, her fingers intertwining with his own in a grip so tight it almost hurt. Neither of them spoke, the weight of their children's faith in them too overwhelming for words. Chapter 5. The First Signs of Hope. Days melted into one another like watercolors, bleeding across wet paper, each sunrise indistinguishable from the last. Their muscles ached with a bone-deep weariness that sleep couldn't cure. Emma's cheeks had hollowed, Max's eyes had lost their sparkle, and Sarah's hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. David caught himself counting their remaining berries obsessively, dividing and redividing the pitiful supply into smaller portions each night. On the fourth afternoon, or was it the fifth, a rustling in the dense undergrowth made them freeze. David instinctively pushed the children behind him, his fingers curling around a heavy branch he'd been using as a walking stick. The ferns parted, revealing not the bear they'd been dreading, but a medium-sized dog with mottled brown and white fur. Burrs and twigs clung to its matted coat, and a long scar ran across its muzzle like a jagged lightning bolt. Its ribs pressed visibly against its sides, but its amber eyes held a wary intelligence that made David lower his makeshift weapon. "Hey there, buddy," David whispered, slowly sinking to one knee on the damp forest floor. His joints protested the movement, sending sharp pains up his thigh. "We mean you no harm." He extended his hand, palm up, fingers slightly curled, the way his grandfather had taught him to approach strange dogs when he was a boy. The dog's nose twitched, nostrils flaring as it sampled their scent. Its tail remained low but gave a single, tentative wag. It took one hesitant step forward, then another, ears alternating between alert and relaxed positions. A patch of fur was missing from its left shoulder, revealing pink skin underneath. "Let's name him Monty," Emma suggested, her voice cracking from disuse. The smile that spread across her dirt-streaked face transformed her. Momentarily erasing the shadows under her eyes, she looked like herself again for the first time in days. "He looks like a Monty, brave but a little scruffy." Max, who had been silent for most of the morning, peered around David's elbow. "Do you think he belongs to someone? Maybe they're looking for him too." Hope flickered in his voice like a fragile flame. "I don't think so, sweetheart," Sarah said gently, brushing Max's tangled hair from his forehead. "See how thin he is? I think he's been on his own for a while." By sunset, Monty had accepted a portion of their dwindling food supply and had settled at the edge of their shelter, head on paws but eyes alert. By morning he had inched closer, his body now pressed against Emma's legs as if he'd been with them all along. By the following afternoon he had become their guide. Monty's ears perked at sounds they couldn't detect, his nose constantly working the air currents. He led them unerringly to a small stream that gurgled between moss-covered rocks, the water so clear they could count the pebbles beneath the surface. David nearly wept at the sight, his parched throat constricting with emotion. They filled the single water bottle they'd salvaged from the crash, passing it around with reverent care, then drank directly from the stream, the cold water numbing their lips and chins. The dog's presence changed their dynamic in subtle ways. Max began talking to Monty in hushed tones when he thought no one was listening, confessing his fears and sharing memories of home. Sarah's shoulders relaxed fractionally when Monty circled their camp at night, his low growl warning away whatever creatures lurked in the darkness. Even David found comfort in the animal's pragmatic approach to survival. No despair, no what-ifs, just the constant forward momentum of living in the moment. On what they later calculated was their 6th day lost, Monty's behavior shifted. His tail began to wag with increasing vigor, and he darted ahead of them, then back, then ahead again, clearly wanting them to follow more quickly. "Look, Monty found a way," Max shouted, his voice stronger than it had been in days. He pointed ahead where the dog was pawing at the ground beneath a tangle of bushes. The plants were heavy with small, dark berries that glistened in the dappled sunlight. Berries, real food. David approached cautiously, examining the fruit with the limited knowledge he possessed. They resembled the huckleberries they'd found earlier, but were larger, their skins a deeper purple-black that stained his fingers when he gently squeezed one. He sniffed them, detecting a sweet fragrance that made his empty stomach clench painfully. "I think they're blackberries," Sarah said, kneeling beside him. She plucked one and examined it closely, turning it in her fingers. "My grandmother had these in her garden." She placed it on her tongue, her eyes closing briefly. "Yes, definitely blackberries." They harvested the berries with methodical care, using Emma's baseball cap as an impromptu basket. The thorns scratched their arms, leaving thin red lines across their already abused skin, but no one complained. They ate slowly, savoring each burst of sweetness, the juice staining their lips and tongues purple. Max's face broke into a genuine grin, berry seeds stuck between his teeth. "This is great," he exclaimed, reaching for another handful. For the first time in days, the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs subsided, replaced by a warm contentment that spread through their bodies. But their newfound optimism proved as fleeting as morning mist. The following day brought torrential rain that fell in sheets so dense they could barely see 10 feet ahead. The forest floor transformed into a treacherous maze of slick mud and hidden roots. Twice Emma slipped and fell hard, the second time twisting her ankle. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, but David saw the tears mingling with raindrops on her cheeks. Their makeshift shelter, which had seemed so ingenious just days before, now revealed its inadequacies with cruel efficiency. The leaf roof sagged under the weight of the water, creating channels that directed streams directly onto their huddled forms. The twigs Emma had so carefully woven began to unravel, allowing the wind to cut through their defenses like icy knives. They pressed together, sharing what little body heat remained, their sodden clothes clinging to goosebumped skin. Monty shook his coat repeatedly, sending sprays of water in all directions, then pressed his warm body against Max's side. The boy buried his fingers in the dog's damp fur, seeking comfort. Night fell early, the darkness absolute beneath the cloud-choked sky. The rain drummed against the leaves overhead, creating a chaotic symphony that made sleep impossible. Water dripped steadily on David's shoulder, no matter how many times he shifted position. Sarah's cough had worsened, each spasm shaking her entire frame. "I can't take this anymore," Max shouted, suddenly, his voice cracking with emotion. He sat up abruptly, dislodging Monty, who whined in confusion. Max's face contorted, illuminated briefly by a flash of distant lightning. "What if we never get out of here? What if we just die and nobody ever finds us and—" His words dissolved into a sob that seemed too large for his small body. "Don't say that," Emma replied fiercely, reaching through the darkness to find her brother's hand. Her fingers closed around his with surprising strength, her knuckles white with determination. "We have to believe we'll be found. Dad's teaching us to survive, and Mom knows about plants, and now we have Monty. People are looking for us right now, I know they are." David watched his children through the gloom, his chest constricting with a mixture of pride and terror. They were so young to face such hardship, yet they showed flashes of resilience that humbled him. He wanted to promise them rescue, to swear that tomorrow would bring salvation, but the words stuck in his throat. "We need to stay strong for each other," he said instead, forcing his voice to remain steady, despite the doubt that gnawed at his insides like a physical presence. "One day at a time, that's how we'll make it." Even as he spoke, he wondered if he was lying to them, offering false hope where none existed. But in the darkness, with the rain falling endlessly around them and his family huddled close, he chose to believe his own words, because the alternative was unthinkable. Chapter 6. A Dangerous Crossing. One afternoon, as they trekked deeper into the forest where the canopy grew so thick that only dappled sunlight penetrated to the forest floor, they found themselves at the edge of a roaring river that cut through the wilderness like a liquid highway. The water, stained amber by tannins leached from fallen leaves, churned violently over smooth boulders and fallen tree trunks. White foam collected in eddies along the banks, spinning in hypnotic circles before being pulled back into the rushing current. Max froze in fear, his thin shoulders hunching forward as if trying to make himself smaller. The backpack he carried seemed to weigh him down even more as he stared at the 30 feet of churning water that separated them from the opposite shore. "I can't do this," he said, his voice barely audible above the river's constant roar. He shook his head, his eyes wide and glassy with unshed tears, as he watched the water rush by, carrying twigs and leaves at a frightening speed. "It's too fast, we'll get swept away." "Monty can show us how to cross," Emma suggested, her dirt-streaked face brightening with hope as she pointed to a series of partially submerged stones that created an uneven pathway across the water. She placed a reassuring hand on her brother's shoulder, squeezing gently. "Look, there are stepping stones. We can use them like a bridge." Despite her encouraging words, her own eyes betrayed uncertainty as she gauged the distance between the rocks and the power of the current swirling around them. David knelt beside Max, ignoring the sharp pain in his own knee where he'd fallen the day before. He turned his son to face him, noticing how the boy's freckles stood out starkly against his pale skin. Leaves and small twigs were tangled in Max's uncombed hair, and a smudge of dirt marked his cheek like war paint. "We have to trust each other, okay?" David said, his voice firm but gentle. He brushed the dirt from Max's face with his thumb. "We can't stay here forever. Night will come and we need to find shelter on the other side, where the trees aren't so dense. We'll do it together, one step at a time." Monty, who had been sniffing along the riverbank, ears perked forward with interest, suddenly gave a confident bark that echoed across the water. Without hesitation, the dog gathered himself and leapt onto the first stone, his nails clicking against the wet surface as he found purchase. He paused, tail held high, then jumped to the next rock with surprising grace for an animal his size. The stone shifted slightly under his weight, but Monty compensated with each movement, navigating the rushing water with the confidence of a creature who understood instinctively how to read the river's moods and movements. Inspired by the dog's successful crossing, they followed one by one. Sarah went first, testing each stone before committing her weight, her arms outstretched for balance like a tightrope walker. Emma followed, mimicking her mother's careful movements, her sneakers slipping slightly on the algae-slick surfaces but recovering quickly. David guided Max to go next so he could follow closely behind him, ready to intervene if necessary. The crossing was fraught with danger at every step. Halfway across, where the current ran strongest and the gaps between stones widened, Max hesitated too long on a particularly wobbly rock. The stone tilted under his shifting weight, and with a cry of alarm that pierced through the river's constant thunder, he slipped. His left foot plunged into the icy waters, instantly soaking his shoe and pant leg up to the knee. The current grabbed at him hungrily, threatening to pull his small body into its relentless flow. David lunged forward with the desperate speed of a parent whose child is in peril, his own footing precarious on the slippery stone. He grabbed Max's arm just in time, his fingers digging into his jacket as he pulled him back to temporary safety. Water splashed up around them, soaking them both, the cold shocking their systems and making their teeth chatter. "Stay close," David warned, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He wrapped one arm firmly around Max's waist, practically lifting the boy to the next stone. "Step exactly where I step, we're almost there." His voice was breathless with fear and exertion, but he forced confidence into it for his son's sake. After what seemed like an eternity of careful steps and held breath, they reached the opposite bank where Sarah and Emma waited with Monty, their faces tight with concern. Once across, they collapsed on the riverbank, their legs folding beneath them as the adrenaline that had propelled them across the water began to ebb. Their clothes clung to their bodies, wet from spray and sweat, and their muscles trembled from the strain of maintaining balance against the river's constant push. "That was too close," Sarah said, her voice quaking with relief as she pulled Max into a fierce hug, not caring about the water that soaked into her own clothes from his. She pressed her lips to the top of his head, inhaling the scent of river water and unwashed hair as if it were the most precious perfume in the world. "You were so brave, Max, so brave." "Monty, you're amazing!" Emma cheered, her face flushed with excitement and residual fear. She reached down to pet the dog, who had shaken himself dry and now sat beside her with an air of satisfaction. His fur stuck up in damp spikes, giving him a comical appearance that belied his heroism. He wagged his tail proudly at the praise, then turned to lick Max's cold hand, as if to say, "See, I knew you could do it." The simple gesture of canine approval seemed to ease some of the tension from the boy's shoulders as he managed a shaky smile in return. Chapter 7. The Cave. After what felt like an eternity of aimless wandering through the dense undergrowth, their legs leaden with exhaustion and their spirits flagging, they stumbled upon a narrow trail cutting through a thicket of ferns and wild blackberry bushes. The path was barely visible, just a slight depression in the forest floor where the undergrowth thinned, revealing patches of dark soil and occasional boot prints preserved in dried mud. The sight of this tenuous connection to humanity filled them with a renewed sense of hope that surged through their weary bodies like an electric current. "Maybe this leads back to civilization," Emma exclaimed, her eyes shining with possibility. She bounced on the balls of her feet, suddenly energized, the fatigue that had been etched across her face moments before, now replaced with animated excitement. She tugged at the frayed strap of her backpack, adjusting it on her shoulders as if preparing for a final sprint toward salvation. Monty seemed to share her enthusiasm, his tail whipping back and forth with such force that it created a small breeze against David's mud-spattered jeans. The dog led the way, his nose twitching frantically as he bounded ahead, pausing occasionally to look back at them as if to say, "Hurry up!" His paws left distinct prints in the soft earth, and he moved with the confident purpose of an animal that had caught the scent of something familiar. But as they ventured further along the winding trail, following its serpentine path deeper into the forest, the atmosphere around them underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation. The towering pines and ancient oaks that had previously stood at a respectful distance now seemed to close in around them, their massive trunks pressing closer to the trail, their gnarled roots snaking across the path like arthritic fingers. The canopy above thickened, the overlapping branches weaving together to form a dense ceiling that blocked out most of the fading daylight. Without warning, a thick fog began to roll in, seeping between the trees like ghostly tendrils. It started as wispy strands that curled around their ankles, but quickly intensified into a soupy mist that swallowed the light and muffled sounds, creating an eerie, otherworldly silence broken only by their labored breathing and the soft crunch of their footsteps on fallen pine needles. The sight of this tenuous connection to humanity filled them with a renewed sense of hope that surged through their weary bodies like an electric current. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with hope as she clutched David's arm, her fingernails digging into the fabric of his jacket. Her eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears darted around, trying to pinpoint the source of the sounds. A strand of her hair had escaped from her ponytail and stuck to her damp cheek, but she made no move to brush it away, all her attention focused on those tantalizing echoes of human presence. "Yes!" Emma shouted, her spirit lifting visibly as she spun around, her mud-caked sneakers leaving circular imprints in the soft ground. "We're getting closer! I can hear them!" Her voice cracked with emotion, and she grabbed Max's hand, squeezing it tightly as if to physically transfer her excitement to her more hesitant brother. They rushed toward the sound, their fatigue forgotten as adrenaline coursed through their veins. Monty sprinted ahead, disappearing momentarily into the fog before reappearing as a dark silhouette against the grayish-white backdrop. The trail began to slope downward, becoming steeper and more treacherous, forcing them to half-run, half-slide down the incline, grabbing at exposed roots and saplings to maintain their balance. The voices grew louder, seemingly just beyond the next bend in the trail, but when they finally rounded the corner, breathless with anticipation, they found themselves facing not a camp of hikers or a ranger station as they had desperately hoped, but the yawning entrance to a cave. The dark opening was set into the side of a rocky hillside, partially obscured by hanging vines and moss. The shadows within loomed ominously, deeper and more absolute than the surrounding forest gloom, and the darkness seemed to swallow the weak beams of their flashlights whole when they directed them into the void. The voices they had heard were nothing more than the peculiar acoustics of the cave entrance, where the wind rushing through hidden chambers and tunnels created sounds eerily reminiscent of human conversation, a cruel trick of nature on their desperate minds. "We can't go in there," Max said, his small body trembling visibly as he took an instinctive step backward, nearly tripping over a protruding rock. His face had drained of all color, and his freckles stood out starkly against his pale skin. "What if there are bears or bats? I saw in a nature show that caves have bats that carry diseases." His voice rose in pitch with each word, threatening to crack with panic. "Or worse," David added, his voice dropping to a low, cautious rumble as he placed a protective hand on Max's shoulder. His eyes narrowed as he studied the cave entrance, noting the claw marks etched into the stone around its perimeter and the scattered animal bones half buried in the dirt nearby. His eyes narrowed as he studied the cave entrance, noting the claw marks etched into the stone around its perimeter and the scattered animal bones half buried in the dirt nearby. Mountain lions sometimes use caves as dens. Let's keep moving. The trail continues around the hillside. Max's face fell at the realization that their moment of hope had been nothing but a cruel illusion, but he nodded solemnly, trusting his father's instincts. His small shoulders slumped beneath the weight of his backpack, and he kicked absently at a pine cone, sending it skittering into the underbrush where it disappeared with a soft rustle. Chapter 8. The Night of Fear. As they trekked further along the trail, night fell with alarming swiftness, the last golden rays of sunlight retreating behind the jagged mountain peaks like fleeing soldiers. They stumbled upon a small clearing, ringed by ancient pines, whose uppermost branches swayed against the indigo canvas of twilight. The sky transformed from deep blue to an impenetrable black, stars emerging one by one like distant watchers, cold and indifferent to their plight. A bitter wind whispered through the clearing, carrying the scent of pine resin and decaying leaves, chilling them to the bone despite their exertion. David dropped his pack with a heavy thud that seemed to echo in the vastness of the wilderness. "We need to make camp," he announced, his voice betraying the exhaustion that had seeped into his muscles. "Emma, Max, gather whatever dry wood you can find. Sarah, help me clear this area." For nearly an hour they struggled to ignite a fire, their fingers numb and clumsy as they arranged kindling in a careful teepee formation. David struck match after match, each one flaring briefly with promise before sputtering out against the damp wood. The bark was slick with moisture from the afternoon's fog, and even the pine needles they'd collected from beneath the protective canopy of trees refused to catch for more than a few tantalizing seconds. Their breath formed ghostly clouds in the beam of their flashlight as the temperature continued to plummet. "The wood's too wet," Sarah murmured, rubbing her hands together vigorously, the friction barely generating enough warmth to stave off the encroaching numbness. "Maybe if we split some of the larger pieces to get to the dry core." David nodded grimly, retrieving his pocket knife, a tool that suddenly seemed woefully inadequate for the task at hand. As darkness solidified around them, shadows from their flashlights danced menacingly across the trunks of surrounding trees, transforming familiar shapes into grotesque silhouettes that seemed to shift and move when viewed from the corner of one's eye. The forest that had merely seemed imposing during daylight now felt actively malevolent, closing in around their small clearing like a predator tightening its circle around wounded prey. Max huddled on a fallen log, his small frame wrapped in the emergency blanket they'd found in the first aid kit, the metallic material crinkling with each tremor that passed through his body. His face, illuminated by the harsh beam of the flashlight propped against a rock, appeared gaunt and older than his 11 years. "I'm scared," he finally admitted, his voice a hoarse whisper as he hugged his knees tightly to his chest. A single tear traced a silvery path down his dirt-smudged cheek, catching the light before disappearing into the collar of his jacket. "What if we never get found? What if there are wolves out there, or bears?" His eyes darted nervously to the impenetrable wall of darkness beyond their meager circle of light. Emma settled beside him on the log, which creaked under their combined weight. She draped her arm around his shoulders, though her own hands trembled visibly. The brave facade she had maintained throughout the day was cracking, revealing the frightened teenager beneath. "Me too," she replied, attempting to sound brave despite the quaver in her voice. She cleared her throat, forcing steel into her next words. "But Dad knows what he's doing, and Monty will protect us. He's part wolf himself, remember? That's what you always say." She ruffled her brother's hair, the gesture so normal, so reminiscent of their life before this nightmare that it brought a fresh ache to David's chest as he watched them. "Look, we're together," he reassured them, crouching down to meet their eyes, forcing confidence into his posture, though exhaustion pulled at every muscle. Search parties will be looking for us by now. But even as he spoke these words of comfort, he struggled to mask his own fear, which gnawed at him like a physical presence. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on his heart. 3 lives depended on his decisions, and out here, one wrong choice could be fatal. Behind his reassuring smile, his mind raced through calculations of their remaining water, their dwindling food supplies, and the dropping temperature that threatened hypothermia if they couldn't get warm soon. Sarah joined their huddle, her arms slipping around David's waist in a gesture that communicated volumes. Solidarity, fear, and determination all conveyed in a single touch. "Your father's right," she affirmed, her teacher's voice steady despite the circumstances. "And we've got our emergency whistle. We'll use it every hour through the night. Someone will hear us." Hours passed with excruciating slowness, each minute stretching like taffy as they huddled together beneath their meager blankets, sharing body heat and whispered stories to keep their spirits up. The clearing was filled only with the persistent rustling of leaves overhead and the occasional distant hoot of an owl that made Max flinch and burrow deeper into his father's side. Monty lay alert at their feet, his ears constantly twitching toward sounds imperceptible to human ears, his warm body providing some comfort against the biting cold. Just as exhaustion began to claim them, dragging their eyelids downward despite their fear, they heard it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps approaching through the underbrush, twigs snapping under deliberate weight. The sound cut through the ambient forest noise like a knife, instantly jolting them to alertness. Their hearts raced in unison. Was it help or danger approaching through the darkness? Had their whistle signals finally been heard, or had they attracted something else entirely? Monty was on his feet in an instant, hackles raised along his spine like a ridge of fur-covered mountains. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, a warning vibration that David felt through the ground more than heard. Before anyone could react, the dog bolted into the darkness beyond their flashlight beams, barking ferociously, each bark echoing through the trees like cannon fire in the stillness of the night. "Monty, no!" David yelled, lunging forward with outstretched hands, but the dog was already gone, swallowed by the darkness that seemed to have physical substance. The sound of his barking grew more distant, then suddenly intensified, accompanied by human voices, shouts of surprise, and the beam of a powerful flashlight cutting through the trees at the edge of the clearing. Monty moved with maternal instinct, positioning herself between the unknown threat and her children. "Stay behind me," she urged, her arm extended protectively across their chests, pushing them back toward the relative safety of the fallen log. Her other hand gripped a heavy branch they'd collected for firewood, knuckles white with determination. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged, preceded by the dancing beam of the high-powered flashlight that momentarily blinded them. The silhouette gradually took human form, a tall man in a weatherproof jacket with reflective strips that caught the light like cat's eyes. Monty circled his legs, no longer barking, but watching vigilantly, his tail held cautiously horizontal. "Hey, are you okay?" The hiker appeared fully in their circle of light, his face etched with genuine concern beneath a woolen beanie pulled low over his ears. His breath formed clouds in the cold night air as he approached slowly, hands slightly raised to show he meant no harm. "We heard your whistle about 20 minutes ago. Been combing this section of the forest since then." Relief washed over David in a wave, so powerful his knees nearly buckled beneath him. "We crashed in the woods," he explained, the words tumbling out breathlessly as the adrenaline that had sustained him began to ebb, leaving him lightheaded. "Our car went off the road during the storm yesterday. We've been trying to find our way back to the highway. We need help. The kids are exhausted and we're almost out of water." The hiker nodded with understanding, already unslinging his pack and retrieving a radio. "Jim, I've found them." He spoke into the device, which crackled with static before a tinny voice responded with coordinates. "The missing family from the news. all alive, cold, but no apparent serious injuries, clearing about half a click east of Checkpoint 3. Within minutes, the clearing transformed from a place of isolation and fear to a hub of activity. The hiker, who introduced himself as Marcus, quickly alerted his search group via radio, and soon a small team of people surrounded the family. They arrived in twos and threes, emerging from the darkness like apparitions, each carrying supplies, water bottles, energy bars, thermal blankets, and, most precious of all, thermoses of hot chocolate that steamed in the cold night air. Chapter 9. Reunion and Healing. The Thompsons were escorted through the moonlit forest to a makeshift rescue camp nestled in a small clearing. Volunteers in bright orange vests bustled around them, their headlamps creating intersecting beams of light that danced across the trampled undergrowth. The camp itself was a haphazard but efficient arrangement of supply tents, medical stations, and a massive central bonfire that sent golden sparks spiraling toward the star-strewn sky. A weathered paramedic with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes wrapped thermal blankets around their shoulders, the metallic material crinkling loudly as it captured their body heat. The blankets smelled faintly of plastic and disinfectant, but they were gloriously warm. Someone pressed steaming mugs of beef broth into their trembling hands, the liquid so hot it burned their tongues, yet they couldn't stop sipping it, the rich saltiness awakening every taste bud after days of granola bars and lukewarm water from dented canteens. "I can't believe we made it," Sarah whispered, her voice catching on each syllable. Tears carved clean tracks down her dirt-smudged cheeks as she pulled Max and Emma against her side so tightly that the children squeaked in protest. Her fingers, still stiff from cold, tangled in Emma's matted hair, working through the knots unconsciously, as if to reassure herself that her daughter was truly there. Max suddenly jerked upright, sloshing broth onto the blanket. His eyes, wide with panic, darted around the bustling camp. "Monty!" he called, his voice cracking with exhaustion and worry. "Where's Monty? Did he come with us?" He scrambled to his feet, the blanket slipping from his narrow shoulders as he spun in a frantic circle. For a heart-stopping moment, the family fell silent, the absence of their four-legged savior suddenly overwhelming. Then, from beyond the circle of firelight, came the unmistakable sound of paws padding through fallen leaves. The dog emerged from the shadows like a ghost materializing, his golden fur caked with mud and burrs, sides heaving with exertion, tongue lolling from his mouth. Despite his bedraggled appearance, there was something regal in his bearing, a dignity that transcended his physical state. "You came back!" Max cried, his face transformed with joy. He flung himself toward the dog, skinny arms outstretched, nearly tripping over an exposed tree root in his haste. Colliding with Monty's solid form, he buried his face in the damp fur, oblivious to the mud now smearing across his cheeks and forehead. "You're my hero, the best dog ever. I knew you wouldn't leave us." Emma approached more slowly, her teenage reserve momentarily forgotten as she knelt beside her brother. She reached out a tentative hand to stroke Monty's mud-crusted ear, her touch gentle as if handling something infinitely precious. "Thank you, Monty," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Her eyes, which had remained dry even during the worst moments of their ordeal, now brimmed with unshed tears that caught the firelight like diamonds. Across the makeshift camp, David and Sarah exchanged glances over the heads of their children, a look laden with exhaustion, relief, and a wordless acknowledgement of how close they had come to tragedy. The firelight carved deep shadows under Sarah's eyes and illuminated the new strands of gray at David's temples that hadn't been there 4 days ago. "We couldn't have made it without him," Sarah agreed, her voice steadier now as she rose stiffly to join her children. She winced as her blistered feet protested the movement, but she pushed through the pain to kneel beside Monty. Her fingers found the sweet spot behind his ear that always made his back leg thump involuntarily against the ground. "Smart boy, brave boy." Monty's tail swept back and forth across the forest floor, scattering pine needles and creating a semicircle of clean earth behind him. His amber eyes, reflecting the dancing flames, moved from face to face as if conducting a final head count of his human pack. Satisfied that all were present and safe, he lowered himself to the ground with a contented groan, his chin resting protectively across Max's lap and his expression radiating the unmistakable pride of a job well done. Chapter 10. Reflections. As the stars pierced the velvet darkness overhead, the Thompsons huddled closer around the rescue camp's bonfire, their faces illuminated by the dancing orange flames. The heat seeped into their bones, thawing the lingering chill of 4 days lost in wilderness that had nearly claimed them. Monty lay stretched between Max and Emma, his golden fur now brushed clean by a volunteer, gleaming like burnished copper in the firelight. Every few minutes, one of the family members would reach down to touch him, as if reassuring themselves that their 4-legged savior was still there. "Remember when Monty found that stream on the second day?" Sarah asked, her voice still hoarse from days of thirst and calling for help. "We would have kept walking in the wrong direction if he hadn't barked and led us to water." David nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he watched Monty's tail thump against the ground at the sound of his name. "And how he growled at that bear before it even came into view. Give us time to climb that ridge." He reached down to scratch behind Monty's ears, his fingers lingering on the small scar above the dog's left eye, a battle wound from protecting them from a raccoon that had tried to steal their dwindling food supply. "I was so scared at times," Max finally admitted, his small fingers buried deep in Monty's thick ruff. His voice quavered as he looked at his sister and parents across the flickering shadows. "When it rained so hard that second night and we couldn't find shelter, I thought we'd never get out." A single tear escaped, tracking down his dirt-smudged cheek. "Me too," Emma replied, squeezing his hand with uncharacteristic tenderness. Her usual teenage bravado had been stripped away by their ordeal, revealing the vulnerability beneath. "But we had each other. That's what got us through." She paused, then added with fierce conviction, "And we had Monty. He never gave up on us, not once." As if understanding, Monty lifted his head and licked Emma's hand, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight like twin flames. The same eyes that had kept watch through 3 frigid nights while they slept in huddled exhaustion. The same eyes that had spotted the search party's flashlights from nearly a mile away, leading the Thompsons toward rescue with insistent barks and tugs on David's tattered jacket sleeve. "He knew exactly what to do when I fell and twisted my ankle," Sarah said softly, reaching down to stroke Monty's flank. "Stayed by my side while you all gathered branches for the stretcher. Then led us along that gentler path I never would have found." Her voice broke as she added, "He's more than a pet. He saved our lives." David nodded, pride swelling in his chest as he surveyed his family and their canine guardian. Monty wasn't just our companion out there. He was our guide, our protector, our early warning system. He chuckled, the sound rusty with disuse, and sometimes our portable heater on those freezing nights. From that night forward, the Thompsons would always remember the lessons learned in the wilderness, the importance of family, the strength found in unity, and the miraculous bond between humans and the animals who choose to stand beside them in their darkest hours. When they finally returned home 3 days later, their story made the local news. Reporters crowded their front yard, cameras flashing as Monty sat regally on the porch steps, his posture somehow conveying both vigilance and triumph. The headline the next day read, "Family Survives Wilderness Ordeal Thanks to Heroic Dog." The accompanying photo showed Monty wearing a makeshift medal crafted by Max from a jar lid and ribbon, a token of gratitude that seemed woefully inadequate for the magnitude of his devotion. In the months that followed, Monty's legend grew. The local pet store offered him lifetime free treats. A children's book author asked permission to tell his story. But none of these accolades mattered to Monty, who simply continued his daily routine of protecting his family, though now with extra treats and a plush new bed by the fireplace, a permanent reminder of the nights when his warmth had been their only comfort in the wilderness. The journey had etched an indelible mark on their souls, forging an unbreakable bond strengthened by shared adversity and the unwavering loyalty of four paws that had carried them home when their own feet had faltered. They emerged from the ordeal transformed, their gratitude as boundless as the wilderness that had nearly claimed them, and as steadfast as the heart of the dog who had ensured it didn't.
Thank you for joining us again at Heartwarming Stories. We hope this tale brought a smile to your face. If you enjoyed this story, please help us spread the joy. Tell your friends about your experience. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a free story. We look forward to sharing another one with you very soon.